All right, that's 6:05 by my clock, so I think we're going to kick off. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the online launch of Outcast, How Jews Were Banished from the Anti-Racist Imagination, a new book by Camilla Bassi, published by No Passaran Media. So thank you very much for joining us. My name's Daniel Randall, and I'm going to be facilitating tonight's event. And I'm going to say a few words just to introduce Camilla, to introduce the book, and to explain the format, and then we'll kick off. So for those that don't know, Dr. Camilla Bassi, who is the other person you should be able to see on your screens, is Senior Lecturer in Human Geography at Sheffield Hallam University. And as well as being a professional scholar, Camilla's a long-standing trade union and socialist activist. She's the chair of the Sheffield Hallam branch of the University and College Union, UCU, and a supporter of the revolutionary socialist group Workers' Liberty. This book, which I think I'm right in saying is your first book, Camilla, emerges out of Camilla's long-standing engagement with radical critiques of race and racism. I'm particularly pleased to be facilitating tonight's event because it allows me to return the favour and the honour that Camilla did me by facilitating the online launch of my book, Confronting Anti-Semitism on the Left, Arguments for Socialists, in 2021. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm a railway worker and trade union activist based in London, and I've written extensively about anti-Semitism, especially on the left, engaging with and learning from Camilla's work along the way. So our books cover similar themes, although from slightly different angles, and we have substantial common ground, but also some differences, some of which I hope we might be able to explore or at least kind of gesture to in tonight's event. So just to say a few words on the format before we kind of kick off properly. As I mentioned before, you should only be able to see Camilla and I. We've got this set up in kind of seminar format. And the reason for that is that it's being recorded and we hope to sort of publish the video from tonight's event. And it just makes it easier in terms of not having to cut anyone else out or worry about sort of GDR permissions or anything like that. So the format will be me asking Camilla some questions. So if you can't see Camilla now, hopefully when she starts speaking, that should automatically spotlight her screen. So fingers crossed that'll be straightforward. So I'm going to be asking Camilla a few questions about the book. So she and I will kind of have an exchange maybe for about 20 to 25 minutes, after which point there'll be an opportunity for people from the audience, from the floor, to ask questions. And to just simplify this, we're going to ask people to submit questions via the chat. So if you've got a question that you want asked, write it in the chat, and that's where I'm going to be taking the questions from. And I'm going to be trying to just select questions that reflect kind of range of topics to give us the sort of fullest possible discussion. So we're aiming for the event to last not too much more than an hour. So we're hoping to finish between 7 and 7:15. So I hope that explains where things are at in terms of the format. And with all that said, to kind of kick us off and open the discussion tonight, I'm going to ask Camilla if you can start by summarising the core argument that you make in this book.
Okay, thank you, Daniel, and welcome everyone. I'm just going to, can people see me now? Because if not, I'll just reclaim host and hopefully my video will show up. Can somebody type into the chat box if they can see me? Oh, you can. Brilliant. Thanks, Joel. That was quick off the mark. So yeah, welcome everyone to my book launch. And Daniel, thank you for agreeing to step in to host this with me. So a summary of the argument of the book. Outcast is an endeavour to explain how much, not all, but much of the academic and activist left who are committed to anti-racism exclude from their consideration of racism contemporary anti-Semitism. Typically, this exclusion happens when, for example, a person who identifies as Jewish raises a complaint of anti-Semitism, which is dismissed through the retort Zionism, Zionism being Jewish nationalism. What's happening here is that the grievance of anti-Jewish racism is assumed to be a fake grievance. It's assumed to be a disguise for protecting, deflecting attention away from, and bolstering the real racism of Israel and Zionism against the Palestinians. This is an anomaly. There's no other complaint of any other kind of racism that is treated by the anti-racist imagination in this way. Laid bare, there's an idea that circulates and has traction within the leftist milieu that when Jews cry anti-Semitism, their devious cry is a ploy to take attention away from the actual racism, not against the Jews, but of the Jews. While it is the case that successive right-wing governments in Israel have weaponized anti-Semitism, at the same time, criticism of the Israeli state and military repression of the Palestinians, criticism which is crucial for any progressive universalist politics, such criticism can and does often slide into the Jewish question. The Jewish question is the classic term for the idea that Jews are harmful to humanity. So Outcast is an effort to explain how much of the academic and activist left banished Jews as victims of racism through the demotion of Jews as racist pariahs. Now, there are two intersecting academic trends that I think help explain how this has happened and how this happens. The first trend is observed by Professor Robert Miles in his Routledge Key Ideas book, Racism, first edition, 1989. Where he states the following: much of the British and North American theorizing about capitalism and racism since the 1960s, while drawing upon the immoral status of racism, which derives to a significant degree from the final solution, utilizes a colonial model, which has little scope to explain much of the European racism of the 19th and 20th centuries, and certainly not that form of racism which others label anti-Semitism. It does, however, have a relevance to the controversial debate about whether or not Zionism can be defined as an instance of racism. So what you had emerging out of the 1960s from the US civil rights movement and into US academia, and then later migrating into UK academia, was an understanding of racism as an exclusively colonial phenomenon that tightly tied racism to the history of colonialism and slavery at the cost of a more holistic view and historical analysis of racism as it co-developed with nationalisms in Europe. To be precise, as Miles puts it, while colonialism was an integral moment in the history of racism, it was actually the articulation between the capitalist mode of production and the nation state, rather than between capitalism and colonialism, that mapped the primary set of social relations within which racism had its origins and initial effects. So one academic trend in the study of racism was the emergence and later dominance of a colonial model of racism in US and UK academia. The other intersecting academic trend can be traced back to the new left of the late 1960s and 1970s and what rode on the success of that new left. The publication in 1978 of Edward Said's book, Orientalism. Now, Orientalism is a foundational text of academic post-colonial theory. Post-colonialism is a critical academic theory that widens the concept of colonialism to analyse how colonial power operates in the present era, decades after the wave of decolonisation ended the main European colonial empires. Said's concept of Orientalism describes the racialised othering of the global East by the global West. This concept of Orientalism is significantly a dualistic cultural schema that falls within a colonial model of racism. So what you have in post-colonial analysis, which, by the way, is the dominant left approach in academia, is the elevation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as the epitome of colonial settler versus native struggle. In this academic literature is a banishment of anti-Jewish racism because Zionism as racism is center stage, and not just any kind of racism, but a particularly despicable racism, a world-leading and destroying racism. Indeed, if and when anti-Jewish racism appears in this analysis, it's to explain how the horror of the Holocaust has been internalized by the Jewish collective in their own genocidal tendency against the Palestinians. In this academic literature, the Jewish question, the idea that Jews are harmful to humanity, blends with a colonial model of racism. So in the words of the post-colonial academic Ilan Pape, the story here is a simple story. It's a story of white people who were persecuted in Europe and who drove away the black people who used to live here. He continues, the villains who present as heroes are the Israelis. I quote, they were and are the servants of the bureaucracy of evil. They come quite innocent into the system, but only the very few among them do not succumb to its raison d'etre and modus operandi. So here explicitly you have the racialized casting of white Jews and black Palestinians into culturally essentialist groups, with the Jews signified the submissive lackeys of evil. The task Pape insists is to expose, isolate, revoke Israel as a pariah state. The task is to banish Israel. And the takeaway message to Jews associated in any way with Israel and Zionism is repent or be doomed.
Thanks, Camilla. And there's obviously a primary focus in the book and in the way you've introduced it there on, of course, on anti-Semitism, on Israel-Palestine, and we'll kind of come back to some of that in a minute. But the next question I wanted to ask was something slightly more general, because it seems to me that part of what you're doing in the book is using the critique of the way the academic and sections of the activist left have come to think about anti-Semitism and Israel-Palestine particularly as a kind of gateway into a wider interrogation and critique of how the academic and activist left thinks about racism and race. And you're kind of making an argument that the way the academic and activist left think about these things has become quite narrow. You use the term just at the end of what you said there, is essentialized, and in fact end up kind of affirming the social construction, i.e. the social construction of race, that anti-racism should be seeking to confront and ultimately kind of dismantle. So I wondered whether you might develop that a little bit and say something about how you think contemporary anti-racism can benefit from taking a more sharply confrontational and critical attitude, not just to the power imbalances that are racism's kind of material manifestation, but to the very social construction of the idea of race.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. So my understanding of race is very much influenced by the sociologist I previously mentioned, Robert Miles, who, drawing on Antonio Gramsci, recognises racism as a common sense ideology. Racism, while a false explanation of the world, works because it seemingly makes sense of real world problems. So anti-immigration racism, for example, has traction as an explanation for why there is a shortage of housing, key public services and well-paid jobs. It's a false explanation, but it seemingly makes sense. Anti-Jewish racism on the left has traction because much of the left is tied to the Jewish question, i.e. believes there is a Jewish question, that something must be done to address the unique harm which Jews pose to humanity. And so the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is seen, elevated and exceptionalized through this lens. So racism is an ideology, and racism is an ideology based on the idea of race. The idea of race has real world reality and consequences. Nevertheless, race per se is not real. And the moment when the anti-racist imagination assumes race is real, it effectively hands a card to the racists. As Marxists, as you and I are, Daniel, we see all social relationships and identities as socially constructed and reproduced through specific class agencies, dynamics and conditions of existence. As such, there should be no space for ideological concepts that claim the opposite. There should be no space for cultural essentialism being the assumption that our cultural differences are decisive and the expression of different inner realities. Race, like other socially constructed differences, doesn't reflect a material inner nature. It's an idea of difference born from the material relations of society that has reality for us in society. When anti-racists contest negative racist ideas about race at the same time as mobilizing race identities in their anti-racist struggle, the end goal of human liberation is self-defeated. There should be no Marxist, leftist, or critical theory of race that effectively makes race real. Instead, there should be theories that deconstruct the idea of race to reveal, tell us something about the role of human signification, meaning production and reproduction, and the exclusionary consequences that flow from that. So racism is an ideology based on the idea of race, and the idea of race is the outcome of a process of racialization, a process of attributing meaning, giving meaning, racial meaning to self and other, or more accurately, self versus the imaginary threat of the other. And what's given racialized meaning? I mean, if we go back to the history of racial science, both apparently biological and social and cultural phenomena. So language featured prominently as a signifier of different races alongside bodily features. And significantly, since the demise of racial science, and even without explicit reference to race, the idea of race and the processes of racialization persist, they live on. And when much of the left claims there's no anti-Semitism on the left, you hear a very common statement. You hear the statement, we're not anti-Semitic because we are not hostile to Jews as Jews. And this is a really unhelpful definition of anti-Semitism because it has no explanatory power. It tells us nothing about the idea of the Jewish other and the process of racialization that constructs this idea. Further still, we have a slippage here into cultural essentialism when, in actual fact, we're human beings first who are both designated with and designate identity. So a genuine response from the left would not be, we are not hostile to Jews as Jews, but would rather be, we are not hostile to Jews because we see all Jews first and foremost as human beings, and most of whom occupy a working class position in capitalist social relations and are our potential allies. And unfortunately, much of the left is not free from cultural essentialism and racialized identity politics. If it was free, then ordinary Jews would not be damned unless they could prove themselves extraordinary Jews, and Zionism would not be condemned as an unprecedented and exceptional aberration and barrier to humanity's progress. What anti-Jewish racist ideology on the left does is it makes monsters out of human beings. This monster is the other to the politicized identity of the anti-racist, anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist self, whose mission is to rescue not just Palestinian victims, but all victims of Zionism, which is anyone who dares to speak the truth about Israel. So much of the left is caught up in a racialized identity script for the Jews and the Palestinians in the tragedy of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which freezes the conflict in time. It freezes the conflict. Both Jews and Palestinians are made into passive actors, not active agents, with Israeli Jews deemed so thoroughly subsumed in racism and colonial aggression that they're generally considered a lost cause to the left.
Thanks, Camilla. I think if we had more time, there's a few things, a few threads in what you've said there that it would be interesting to kind of pull on and see where they led us. We've ended up at the end of what you said, kind of back at the question of Israel-Palestine, and that's what I wanted to prompt you to speak about next. I mean, obviously this is a enormous topic on very many levels, and I think we would both agree, and this is obviously affirmed in your book, that any kind of left-wing discussion about this issue, you know, does need to acknowledge the contemporary material reality and the colonial relationship that does exist between the Israeli state and the Palestinians, and kind of make that clear. What I wanted to prompt you to talk about here, because I think this might be an interesting way of sort of opening some of this up. Wonder whether you might talk specifically about the influence of a particular theorist who looms very large in the book, which is Maxime Rodinson. So I imagine a lot of people in the meeting will have some familiarity with Rodinson and his work, but just to introduce him, he was a French Marxist scholar who was one of the people who pioneered really the analysis of Israel as a settler colonial state, and you know, very much a anti-Zionist, but I think perhaps not what we might call an absolute anti-Zionist. So very important figure in terms of the analysis of Israel as a state and in terms of its colonial project vis-a-vis the Palestinians, but someone whose work has largely receded from view in most left thinking about Israel-Palestine. And you argue very strongly in the book for a reconnection with his analysis, and argue that that reconnection would transform and improve contemporary left thinking about Israel-Palestine. So could you tell us why?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. So Maxine Rodinson was an independent Marxist historian, Orientalist and sociologist whose research focused on Islam and the Arab world. He was a prolific scholar and he wrote several books, including Islam and Capitalism, Muhammad, Europe and the Mystique of Islam, Israel, a Colonial Settler State, ? Cult, Ghetto and State, the Persistence of the Jewish Question, Israel and the Arabs, Marxism in the Muslim World and the Arabs. And I excavate Rodinson's work, specifically his work on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, as an exemplar of how the racist and colonial dimensions of Israel can be understood relatively without an absolute moral damnation of the Jewish collective or a moralistic resolve to destroy Israel. His work is a way out and a way forward from the conclusions drawn from post-colonial research on Israel-Palestine, post-colonial research which identifies Zionism in Israel as a particularly harmful settler colonialism, a particularly harmful ethnic cleansing and genocide, a particularly harmful and illegitimate nationalism, and a particularly harmful racism, and that sees Israel as both an outlier of the decolonization era and the forerunner of colonialism, imperialism, and racism to come. So the Palestinian-Israeli conflict for Rodinson is not an exceptional tragedy produced by uniquely bad Jews, despite the legitimate grievances of the Palestinians, and its resolution is not one that exceptionally demands the erasure of Israel. Rodinson considered the formation of Israel a historical error and a wrong done to the Palestinians, and he pioneered an analysis of Israel as a colonial settler state. He coined the concept of Israel as a colonial settler state. However, his work has either been critiqued or mostly ignored by the left in academia, the post-colonial and the Marxist left, for two interrelated reasons. One, because of his acceptance of the reality of Israel as a nation state on pre-1967 borders, and related to that, his plea for a two nations, two states settlement. And two, because I think of his assessment of Zionism in the context of European anti-Semitism, colonialism, and nationalism. That is beyond the framework of a colonial model of racism and the Jewish question. Rodinson's legacy has more generally been displaced by the academic success of Said's Orientalism and thereafter post-colonial studies, which positions Zionism and Israel firmly into an enemy camp of racism and colonialism incarnate, and in the main insists that it's absolutely necessary to undo Israel. Now, in confronting anti-Semitism on the left, your book, Daniel, you explore and you identify and explore three historical strands to anti-Semitism on the left, the third being Stalinist anti-Zionism, that frames Zionism, i.e. Jewish nationalism, as a transcendent force of imperialism, colonialism, and racism. And it seems to me that this Stalinist anti-Zionism shaped the general approach of the new left to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict after 1967. That is, after Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Indeed, Rodinson cautions of Said's book Orientalism, and by the way, Rodinson was praised in Orientalism as an exceptional Orientalist, other than the ones that Said damned. Rodinson cautions of Said's book Orientalism that it was a Stalinist polemic in its dual camp delineation of the world into adversaries and allies, which translates into colonial settler versus native, white versus black, harmful Jew versus Palestinian victim. And what this dual camp does, tragically, is it locks in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, it locks it in. And the task instead is to construct an alternative and an independent force of political force and action, by and for the interests of all working classes, trade unionists, secularists, anti-racist, feminists, queer activists, and so on, that can transcend socially constructed differences amongst us. And Rodinson stands in this tradition, which is why his work is so refreshing and important as a way out and a way forward.
Thanks, Camilla. So just to kind of flag up in terms of format, I can see people are already putting questions in the chat, which is great, which means we'll have plenty to go on. So I'm going to give Camilla a kind of couple more prompts, and then we're going to move into questions from people in the room. And probably just need to keep an eye on the time for doing that, because we're at past now. So the next thing I wanted to prompt Camilla with is something around divisions often drawn in these discussions, and particularly in the activist left. One encounters, in fact, on both sides of this debate, people will criticize their opponents for dividing Jews up into good Jews and bad Jews. So, on both sides, they will see if somebody from the other side of the debate, whether it's about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party or whatever it might be, kind of invokes a Jewish voice. People on the other side will say, "Oh, so you're saying that's the good Jew, and the ones who agree with us are the bad Jews," and that's basically what it boils down to. Really, it's a kind of often vicarious tokenizing, where the good Jews are the ones who agree with you, and the bad Jews are the ones that don't. And you critique this thinking in your book, and that kind of framework, arguing that the left sort of sets up this hierarchy where it approves of and amplifies the so-called extraordinary Jews, which is your term for Jews that have kind of abandoned any affinity, however diffuse, with Israel, and kind of damns the rest. However, you're clearly not saying that the left has to accept without criticism the sort of identitarian or particularist claims of historically oppressed groups, which ironically is something the left does sometimes imply, but usually with a blind spot or exception made for Jews. So the question is, how can the left make criticisms of identitarian, particularist, nationalist political claims made by Jews or members of any other historically oppressed group in a way that doesn't require that essentializing or kind of tokenizing good Jews, bad Jews framework?
Thanks, Daniel. So it's a lot there. So when much the left say we are not anti-Semitic because we are not hostile to Jews as Jews, this same left has a prerequisite for all people who identify as Jewish to break whatever connection they have with Israel and Zionism, to totally condemn Israel and Zionism, and to declare loudly that Zionism is the threat to humankind and that Israel from the river to the sea must go. That's quite a prerequisite for admission into the left's universal human collective. Does this same left have a similar prerequisite for anyone else who in some way might be associated with an ethnic group or a nation state that has done and is doing awful things to other peoples? No. So following Hannah Arendt's observations of the Enlightenment's approach to the Jewish question, I think what we have on the left is the demand that ordinary Jews must educate and enlighten themselves into becoming exceptional Jews, and not just exceptional in comparison to other Jews, but, quoting Arendt, exceptional specimens of humanity. So the bad Jew and the good Jew, the Zionist Jew and the absolute anti-Zionist Jew, the ordinary Jew and the exceptional Jew exist because of the presence of the Jewish question, the question of what is to be done about the harm that Jews pose to humanity. If the left is to recognise and overcome the anti-Jewish racist ideology in its midst, it needs to see and release its Jewish question, which dialectically casts the bad Jew and the good Jew, the Zionist Jew and the absolute anti-Zionist Jew, the ordinary Jew and the exceptional Jew. And we can engage with people who identify as Jewish about the problems of nationalist and chauvinist politics, first and foremost as human beings and as potential allies and comrades. And much of the left simply does not do this. They see first and foremost ordinary Jews, and they will only engage with Jews who have proven themselves to be exceptional Jews. Consequently, the Israeli Jewish and diaspora Jewish working class is generally written off. These Jews are damned and doomed as having no progressive role to play in societal change. So the ongoing huge protest movement against Netanyahu's government in Israel, which has radical elements within it that are worthy of our support and solidarity, not least because the plight of the Palestinians depends on these elements growing and strengthening, this protest movement is wholesale written off by parts of the left, who effectively say, look away, there's nothing to see here, just a bunch of ordinary bad Jews. So sadly, I think because much of the left has a worldview so subsumed within the Jewish question, it needs its Zionist other as part of its own identity as anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and anti-colonialist.
Okay, thanks, Camilla. So I'm going to put one more kind of prompt to Camilla, and then we're going to take some questions from the chat. And Camilla, I might just have to ask you to slightly truncate your answer to this one, just to give us as much time as possible for audience questions. So look, the obvious or an obvious question that arises out of all of these debates, if we want to repurpose a phrase from Marx and Engels, to descend from language into life, if we want to operate at the level of kind of action rather than solely at the level of thought and theory. Obviously, there's not a hard distinction between these things, but if we want the ideas that we're talking about to impel action and social transformation and change in some way, an obvious question that arises from all that is, what do we do? So the final prompt I wanted to put to you is to ask what you see as the activist imperatives that arise from your analysis, and what should the people in this meeting or the people who read your book and are convinced by its arguments go and do?
Okay, so this book is consciously an academic intervention. And one of the spaces in the academy where thought and activism are co-created is through the university decolonisation agenda. And decolonisation of the university is a contemporary and political project that extends from post-colonial academic work that strives for university curriculum and teaching that critically challenges white, Eurocentric, Western and global North knowledge systems structured by power relations of colonialism. As such, decolonise the university is a particular anti-racist demand in the context of higher education, which views racism through a colonial model. Outcast raises some really important questions and answers for this decolonisation and anti-racism agenda that I sincerely hope get discussed and debated. So notably, how do we recognise, explain and overcome the fact that much contemporary theorising about race and racism leaves aside the question of anti-Semitism? How does the ghost of Israel-Palestine haunt this separatism between racism and anti-Semitism? Why is it that most post-colonial research on settler colonialism, which is a paradigm that potentially opens up wide-ranging sites of comparison, why is it that this research focuses on, in the main, and mostly white European settler colonialism, and therein Israel-Palestine, to the omission of other settler colonial relationships, such as Russia, Chechnya, and China, Tibet? So while this book is primarily an academic intervention, it illustrates the intellectual legitimacy that I think is given to much of the the activist left, when it implicates, when parts of this activist left implicate the Jewish other, it's part and parcel of a clandestine and sinister global Zionist network to shut down criticism of Israel, dominate the world and threaten world peace. So I hope Outcast helps guide difficult but necessary discussions and debates in the activist milieu as well. I have got one final point to make, but I'm going to hold off making it and like you say, bring some questions in from the audience.